1943 was the year, and the war had already depleted the strength of Europe till it reached its peak. Ships carrying men with graying faces navigated waterways that were patrolled by destroyers and planes as they traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. The guys in question were not free. They were enslaved prisoners who had been taken captive in North Africa and then transported to the United States, which is located thousands of miles distant. This was the very first time that many of them had ever been outside of Europe. They anticipated seeing adversaries waiting with their fists clenched and their faces contorted in anger. A nation that is rife with poverty and is covered up by misinformation. Instead, as the hatches opened in the harbors of New York and Boston, the first sounds that they heard were the laughing of dock workers and the rolling rhythm of jazz that was pouring from radios. The crowds who were jeering did not accompany the march from the docks to the trains. Rather, they were curious about what was going on. Children in the United States of America pointed, whispered to their parents, and some even waved. All of the convicts, who were still wearing their dusty Africa course uniforms, moved uncomfortably. On that particular evening, a corporal by the name of Ernst Heinemann noted in his journal, "They did not throw stones. They wore a grin. It is more peculiar than any conflict that has occurred on the crowded trains." A tale was revealed to them by the vista that was visible from the window, and no German commander had prepared them for it. The plains of Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Ohio were traversed by fields that stretched for miles without any fences connecting them. These fields were broken up by barns that were so vast that they resembled factories. The inmates muttered to one another, "How could such a large amount of land belong to ordinary farmers back home?" Even barons ruled smaller estates. The trains made stops at regular intervals of a few miles in order to load supplies, including crates of oranges, barrels of milk, and stacks of bread. These were not luxuries that were saved for officers. Rather, they were food that was waiting at stations in small towns. Hans Richter recalled a single notion that kept running through his brain over and over again. If they are allowed to feed their citizens in this manner, then what are they going to feed their soldiers? As the trains traveled through the cities at night, the guys pressed their faces against the glass with their hands. The streets of Berlin and Hamburg were rendered quiet and dark by the use of blackout curtains. On the other hand, neon lights were visible from the rails, and they were shining over restaurants and movie theaters. There were entire neighborhoods that were portrayed as if the conflict had never occurred. Under his breath, one of the lieutenants could be heard saying, "This is a trick. During times of conflict, no nation wastes power in such a manner." However, no one responded to him. Over 400 prisoner-of-war camps had been established across the United States by the time the year 1943 came to a close. Farmland in Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, where there was a demand for laborers and where there was ample area to accommodate thousands of people, were the largest. Despite the fact that they were still anticipating harsh punishment, the Germans were marched under watchtowers with their boots crunching on gravel. In spite of this, the barracks were equipped with wood flooring, clean bunks, and blankets. Most of the time, the guards were young guys themselves, and they were not much older than the inmates. Men who had survived sandstorms in North Africa were greeted with smiles and offered cigarettes or gum to others who had experienced them. The air in Texas was different from the air in other parts of the world. It was hot, thick, and fertile, and it carried the aroma of corn and hay rather than dust. On the first night, a soldier named Carl Weber, who had been caught near Tunis, muttered to his bunkmate, "They want to weaken us with comfort." Weber had been seized near Tunis. They are required to. A prisoner is never properly fed by his adversary. However, as daylight arrived, he discovered that the reality was more difficult to ignore. Each individual in the queue for breakfast carried a metal tray, and the line extended all the way across the mess hall. The vats of scrambled eggs, sausages, oats, and bread that were located next to them started to emit steam. A pot of stuff that was thick and brown caused the Germans to be perplexed. The chefs referred to it as peanut butter, and they spread it on toast with a familiarity that was almost unavoidable. The majority of the inmates avoided it on the first day because they were apprehensive of its peculiar texture. However, even without it, the massive amount of food that was served was astonishing. In 1943, the typical pea ration in the United States had more than 3,000 calories per day, which was higher than the daily consumption of many German civilians in Berlin at the same time. This information comes from quartermaster records. "We are treated better than our own soldiers on the front," said one prisoner in a letter that was sent home. How is it even possible for this to happen? The contrast struck a chord deep within. The United States of America had been portrayed as feeble, unorganized, and scarcely capable of fighting a war without the assistance of the British or the Soviet Union for many years. In spite of this, the proof was there, standing on their plates, indisputable, and becoming hot in the early morning air. Despite this, the most peculiar finding, which was about the flavor of peanut butter, had not yet been made. Coffee, fried bacon, and freshly baked bread were the aromas that filled the mesh hall at Camp Hearn, Texas. These were offered to troops who had suffered the sweltering heat of the desert in North Africa and the terrible dearth of resources in Europe. It was a sense-altering scent. There were rows of convicts who were clattering their trays in their hands as they walked in. Their eyes darted over the vats of food that appeared to be more of a celebration than a ration line. A massive metal tub that was filled with a material that they had never seen before was placed on one of the corner tables. Thick golden brown and almost like clay in appearance. Despite its reluctance, it adhered to spoons and spread itself on white bread. The American chef smiled as he placed a dollop of the mixture onto the platters. "Peanut butter," he declared, as if the term was something that every single person on the planet was familiar with. A look of perplexity was passed between the Germans. The corporal, Ernst Heinemann, who had written about the children waving in New York, glanced at the peculiar paste. Heinemann had written about the youngsters. He nibbled on it while pressing it to his lips, and he felt the greasy deliciousness make its way into his mouth. On the dention, his face was contorted and he slept. He mumbled, "It is so sticky that it sticks to the teeth." He was surrounded by men who chuckled uneasily, not knowing if they were laughing at food or at some American joke. Without a certain peanut butter was unheard of in Berlin. Nuts were extremely scarce, sugar was even more scarce, and oil was a luxury item that was only reserved for commanders and entrepreneurs. Prisoners were provided with a meal that was so lavish that it seemed to be decadent. As Karl Weber continued to be under the impression that this was some kind of examination, he tossed it aside and proceeded to fill his tray with eggs and sausage. On the other hand, younger troops, who were both intrigued and hungry, came back for more spoonfuls. Over the course of the evening, Hans Richter jotted a brief sentence into his notepad. "That flavor is unlike anything else we have. Delicious, salty, and hefty. On a daily basis, the Americans consume this. Given that this is their level of poverty, what about their wealth?" For a longer period of time than the flavor itself, the question persisted. The numbers only served to increase their sense of uneasiness. According to quartermaster records, the United States of America produced more than 200 million pounds of peanut butter in the year 1943. You might find it in the lunchbox of every single school-aged youngster. Men who had been accustomed to weighing their food in ounces, scraping the bottom of ration cans, and exchanging smokes for a slice of bread were taken aback by the figure. A lieutenant who had been on the Eastern Front raised his slice, which was heavily coated with the paste, and posed the following question to the other troops seated at his table. "If they give this to us, they're prisoners. What do their soldiers that are serving at the front eat? We have no hope of success if even their youngsters are treated like kings when they eat." It was the stillness that followed that was more weighty than any words. Some guys had developed a fondness for it by the third day, and they devoured it with a voracious appetite, while others swore that it made them ill. But the influence was not limited to the sense of taste. Peanut butter started to be seen as a representation of the unfamiliar culture by the PS. They had entered a straightforward meal that exemplified size, extravagance, and peculiarity within its own essence. The perplexity was spread across the seas via letters that were sent home. One of the inmates wrote to his wife, Today they provided us with a paste that was made from nuts. I have no idea how to describe it. All I know is that it has a thick consistency like butter, yet it tastes sweet and rich. It is something that they do on a regular basis. Something that we could never even fathom happening in Germany. Each and every mouthful served as a constant reminder that the world they had battled to conquer was significantly larger, considerably weirder, and far more bountiful than anything that their commanders had portrayed. A few of the men laughed at the stickiness of their fingers as they licked them. Some people spit into napkins in a stealthy manner. But regardless of whether they liked it or not, the initial taste of peanut butter remained in their memories. There was no longer an exclusive focus on the cuisine. When it came to a system that was so strong that it could squander calories on convicts while Europe starved, it was all about size, about difference, and about proportion. When they saw the magnitude of the fields and industries in the United States, what would they think if a single tablespoon of peanut butter could generate such confusion? As the convicts went back into the Missal the morning after their first experience with peanut butter, they did so with the expectation that the indulgence would indeed turn out to be an error. As far as they were concerned, no government could possibly maintain such rations for its adversaries. Despite this, the tables moaned under the weight of greater quantities of food than the majority of them had seen in a month. Photographs of fresh milk that was so cold that it caused the glass to fog up. Scrambled eggs, porridge that was sweetened with sugar, sausage links that were shimmering with fat, and so on. The abundance was uncomfortable for the guys who had survived in the Reich on soup that was extremely watery and bread that was extremely hard. After some time had passed, Otto Klein, a prisoner, wrote, "It was as if every morning was Christmas." I was unable to connect that with the information that we had received about shortages before to the capture. The records of the quartermaster shed light on a harsh reality. During the year 1943, the typical German civilian diet consisted of around 1,500 calories per day, which was just about sufficient to maintain strenuous labor. On the other hand, even physical education students in the United States were given more than 3,000 calories per day, which is about twice as much as eggs alone. These eggs were transported in refrigerated train wagons from the Midwest and arrived in the millions each week. A number of people found the data to be intolerable. When a guard casually mentioned that American soldiers overseas received more than the prisoners, Sergeant Karl Weber counted every piece of bread on his plate and whispered at the same time that this single meal was more than what his family in Hamburg received in 3 days. Incapable of providing an explanation, Weber gazed blankly. New surprises were prepared for lunch, including beef stew that was rich with potatoes, bread dipped in butter, and apples stacked high in bowls. Simply looking at the fruit looked surreal. Apples were an uncommon and luxurious treat in Europe during the war. In spite of this, they were allowed to roll freely off the containers as if no one cared whether they were bruised. There was a sudden appearance of grapefruits in the afternoon, and their sour aroma filled the air. The majority of the detainees had never seen one before. Over the course of supper, there were photos of milk put on each table. As the detainees nervously giggled and inquired as to whether or not they were intended for youngsters, the guards shook their shoulders. Simply said, milk was a component of the diet. Individuals in Germany who were accustomed to experiencing shortages felt as though they had stumbled across a fairy tale. Only a few people readily embraced it. In his notebook, Ernst Heinemann, who was the first person to record the smiles of children in the United States, acknowledged, "I cannot eat without thinking of my wife waiting in line for bread. When you eat, you feel guilty." In spite of this, there were some who took advantage of the abundance by securing rolls and apples for later use. Hans Richter provided the most elucidating description of the inner conflict. Because if they are able to feed us in such a manner, then perhaps everything we have been told about America is incorrect. In the event that what we were told is incorrect, then what other things are not true? No longer was the food only a means of subsistence. It was a weapon that was more effective than propaganda alone. By the end of the first month, the inmates had become accustomed to eating more than they had ever eaten before in their whole experiences. The shock was not, however, lessened by habit. At Thanksgiving, each new dish consisted of roast turkey. They were more removed from the reality that they had believed in as a result of eating pumpkin pie in December. If the adversary had the ability to ensure that prisoners were treated like kings, what would they learn about the region itself? The farms that continuously generated an infinite supply of goods. By 1944, a significant number of German prisoners had been sent beyond the barbed wire to work in the states of Texas, Oklahoma, and Iowa under an overseeing authority. Every morning they were put into trucks and hauled over expanses of farmland that went further than any soldier could actually see. Because of the scale, I was confused. One afternoon, as they rode by, Karl Weber, the skeptic, counted the furrows on the land. In Germany, a farm may span 30 or 40 acres, but in this place, single families cultivate hundreds and often thousands of acres. It was told by a local farmer that his field was more than 1,000 acres in size, which is greater than several whole German communities. It was Weber who murmured, "In Germany, this individual would be referred to as a baron. It is merely a farmer that he is here." A variety of tasks, including gathering fruit, fixing fences, and baling hay, were assigned to the inmates. However, it was not the work that took them by surprise. Machines were the culprits. Tractors with steel wheels that were higher than a man sped over the fields, dragging reapers that picked grain at a speed that no horse could equal. More than 2,500 tractors were in operation by 1944 in only one county in Iowa, according to the archives. It was impossible for Germany to keep even a small portion of such capacity for the PS because of the bombardment and fuel shortages that they were experiencing. It was almost as if the land itself had been mechanized, providing food not just for the United States of America, but even for its allies in other countries. A line was written down in Hans Richter's notepad as he scrolled. A single farm in the United States provides food for more soldiers than a full division in Germany. On rare circumstances, what strategies may we employ to combat the land itself? A peek of the industries that eat the harvests is given to the prisoners. The rail lines were filled with a never-ending stream of trains, grain cars, livestock cars, and refrigerated cars that were en route to faraway towns. An individual who was guarding the inmates boasted to them that a facility in Chicago processed 10,000 pigs every single day. The number was nonsensical, but the subsequent trainload of meat appeared to demonstrate that it was. Later on, while they were working in the vicinity of Houston, they observed shipyards where Liberty ships were constructed in a matter of weeks rather than months. In the darkness of the night, the sky was lighted by the clang of hammers and the arc of welding torches. Only in 1943, American shipyards sent more than 2,700 vessels into service. The Germans did not consider it to be an industry. Sorcery was involved. Over the course of many years, they had been informed that the United States of America was a decadent and disorderly nation, whereas the Reich was a stronghold of discipline and order. On the other hand, this order was superior to anything else they had witnessed. All of the fields were harvested on schedule, all of the trains arrived on time, and every factory was bustling with rhythm. According to the confession that Ernst Heinemann made in his journal, we believed that their chaos was our advantage. It is now clear to me that their disorder is affluence. Every single one of our failures yields more than our successes. While the inmates were resting beside a barn one evening after a hard day of transporting sacks of maize, a farmer's kid who was no more than 12 years old arrived in a vehicle that was practically comparable in size to an apartment in Berlin. He extended his hand and inquired, "You guys are in need of water." Drinking in quiet, the captives drank. While the young kid was driving away, Weber mumbled, "If their children are able to command such machines, then what can their armies expect to command?" Unanswered, the query lingered in the shadows of the night. The farm lights began to turn on one by one, shining brightly against the darkening sky, lighting that would have been prohibited in Germany during the blackout. In addition, the captives came to the realization that they had not yet witnessed the entirety of this new reality. In the event that farms and factories showed such astonishing enormity, What disclosures would come about when they encountered the people themselves, the guards, the youngsters, and the civilians whose humanity defied every instruction that was hammered into them? The captives had become used to the routines of American life by the time the summer of 1944 rolled around. Awaken at the crack of dawn, perform your duties in the sunlight, and make your way back behind the wire by the time the sun goes down. Nevertheless, the magnitude of the fields and industry was not the only thing that astonished them. It was the average person. Small contacts, which occurred on a daily basis, chipped away at the fortress of dogma that had been built up inside of them. In the labor details, the wives of farmers left baskets of sandwiches and jugs of iced tea for their husbands. Some of the guards, who were just a few years older than the inmates themselves, distributed smokes as if they were nothing more than a waste of time. While trucks hauling PS rumbled over country roads, children waved from their bicycles from the sidelines. Every grin was a direct challenge to the stereotype of Americans as being dishonest and unfriendly. The following is a passage from Hans Richter's diary. I expected hostility. I discovered compassion. Even the children of those parents meet us with interest rather than contempt. This weapon is the most effective one they have for disarming. At Camp Tonkawa, located in Oklahoma, a young American guard by the name of Private Miller became a source of fascination for the German security personnel. As a habit, he chewed gum and made a loud cracking sound. Moreover, he handed a stick to a prisoner at some point in time. With a grimace on his face, the German gently unwrapped it and tasted the sweet and minty flavor. He was undecided whether to consume it or spit it to the ground. Miller chuckled and proceeded to explain through motions that it was intended to be chewed for an indefinite amount of time. As time went on, the camp was crowded with Germans chewing gum in an odd manner and passing around sticks of gum like they were antiques. At the same time, the act represented both luxury and peculiarity to them. It is frivolous and wasteful, and yet it brings pleasure, Ernst Heinemann said in his famous essay. They inhabit a universe in which even their lips are never empty of food or drink. It is not true that guards were responsible for every contact. Children would occasionally congregate close to the walls in Texas, eager to learn more about the guys who were inside. Baseballs, paper notes, and even little sweets were among the items that they threw over the wire. The inmates, who were affected by the innocents, answered with drawings of birds, carved ornaments made from wood, or melodies that were sung quietly in the nighttime air. Later on, a young child shared with his father, "They are similar to us, but they are dressed differently." That straightforward phrase, which had been passed down via the rumor mill, made its way to the ears of the convicts and carried more weight than any inquiry. The fault lines that were spreading within them were exposed by the letters that were mailed home. "They treat us better than we would treat them," a lieutenant said to his wife. "We would always treat them better." When it is reported in the press that Americans are weak, you should not trust them. In ways that we could never have anticipated, they are powerful. An additional soldier, taking care not to give the impression of being disloyal, said, "There is more here than I can write." Should you be able to witness their way of life, you would not be able to identify the adversary that they describe in Germany. Each sentence was a silent defiance, a violation of the certainty that they had brought with them into captivity from the beginning. For other people, the compassion was intolerable, and it was even more perplexing than the brutality. During the night, Karl Weber, who had been the most steadfast in his commitment to skepticism, mumbled, "If they hate us, I can fight them. If, however, they treat us as though we are men, then what weapons are left?" The question traveled around the barracks like a whisper, and along with it came an even greater sense of discomfort. If the humanity of their adversary was in fact genuine, perhaps their authorities had lied not only about the United States of America, but about everything else as well. What would happen if even symbols of ideology, such as uniforms, salutes, and allegiance itself, started to fall apart beneath the weight of things like peanut butter, chewing gum, and the grins of children? By late 1944, it was no longer feasible to overlook the paradoxes that had been occurring. What started off as a peculiar substance known as peanut butter had developed into something far more profound, a gnawing doubt that eroded the roots of belief. Despite the fact that they continued to sing the traditional marching tunes and continued to wear their field-gay clothes, the convicts' voices conveyed less conviction. The change was disclosed by letters that were filtered but not silenced. In a confession to his brother, Hans Richter stated, "Here, I have consumed more meat in the past 6 months than I have in the previous 3 years at home. If the United States of America is able to provide this for convicts, then everything that we were told about their vulnerability is untrue." A taste of peanut butter, which had before been a source of fascination, now represented the disintegration of certainties. This was more than just food. In other words, it was evidence of wealth, of a system that flourished while Europe went hungry. Their brains were constantly going over the data. It was only in 1944 that American factories had produced 96,000 aircraft, which was more than Germany could have ever imagined manufacturing. Wheat was produced by farms in the billion bushels variety. The trains transported an infinite supply of goods across 2 oceans. During one evening in the barracks, Karl Weber, who had before been a skeptic, finally fell down. "This is a fiction that we have fought for," he muttered. "And if they are able to feed their prisoners in such a manner while still building troops that are more powerful than ours, then the Reich has already been defeated." After a prolonged period of heavy and potentially hazardous quiet, no one challenged his assertions. Although some inmates stuck to their allegiance with all their might, others started to view their captors not as adversaries but rather as models to follow. In a piece that he had previously written about feeling guilty with every mouthful, Ernst Heinemann made the following observation: "Perhaps freedom does not lay in triumph, but in confessing what is true." A large number of individuals volunteered to take English classes when American guards offered them, while others joined camp orchestras using instruments that were given by their captors. The evenings were filled with music, and for a little while the conflict seemed to be far away. When contrasted to the flavor of milk, the buzz of electricity, and the glow of a movie light flickering in town, ideology, which had previously defined them, appeared to be frail at this point. Peanut butter, which was spread generously on bread and adhered to the roof of their mouths, continued to be the source of their confusion. The men began to make jokes about it, but it also became a symbol that they kept coming back to again and over again. It exemplified the peculiarities that are characteristic of the United States of America, the richness that defied belief and the comfort that destroyed hatred. One of the final notes that Hans Richter made in his diary during the conflict was as follows: "The Führer spoke of iron and blood. Here, however, the strength rests in the bread, butter, and weird nut paste that are used. If people are able to live in such a manner while waging a war on a global scale, then perhaps the future is not ours, but rather in their hands." During the time that Germany itself was falling apart in 1945, many captives were no longer concerned with whether or not the Reich would survive. Rather, they were concerned with how they would survive after being held captive. Some people had the hope of taking these teachings about democracy, plenty, and even peanut butter back with them to their homes. When they returned to the ruins, others were terrified of what they might find there. At this point, the philosophy that had formerly held them together was in shattered pieces. In addition, the first crack, which was the one that they never forgot, had the flavor of something straightforward, sticky, and American.